morning for another water issues seminar. Today we have Pete Boulay with us from the Minnesota State Climatology Office. Pete says that he began watching the weather when he was 9 years old, keeping a daily weather log, something that he is still keeping to this day. And I'm curious if Pete actually still has that weather log that he kept when he was 9.
Yep.
That would be really interesting to see. Pete received a degree in meteorology and broadcasting from St. Cloud State University back in the day, and has been working for the Minnesota State Climatology Office since 1998. He acts as an operational climatologist, which I will need some definition of, Pete, as you go forward. I don't know what an operational climatologist is, but he says he handles many of the data requests that arrive at the office, and he works at the in the Borlaug Hall over in St. Paul campus for the Department of for the DNR,
Yep.
Department of Natural Resources. He is also the statewide coordinator of various volunteer rain gauge networks in the state. And as I said, he still keeps a daily weather log. Today, he's going to talk about the history of lake ice measurements in Minnesota. Pete, I got to say, I have been looking forward to your talk for a while now, ever since we lined it up. Why don't you take it away? The floor is yours.
Okay. Thanks, Mark. Can everybody hear me okay before I talk too far? And then is
You're
can you
coming
hear me
through
okay?
fine, I
Okay,
think.
good. All right. Thanks, Mark, for having me here today. I know if you look out the window, it's hard to think spring, but rest assured, spring is coming. I'm going to talk today a little bit about Minnesota lake ice history. Always a very interesting topic, very timely for spring. In March, we always have this on our minds. This is a photograph of one of my favorite places, one of my favorite lakes. This is Lake Itasca up at Itasca State Park. And that's the headwaters, and you can walk across the rocks. And when there's still ice on the lake up there, it's not very busy. So if you ever want to be alone in Lake Itasca or Lake Itasca State Park, that's the time to be there. And some beautiful pictures too. Let's be sure I get this advancing right. There we go. A little bit about me that Mark said. I started watching weather when I was 9. Went to St. Cloud State University. Grew up in the Twin Cities. Worked for a private weather company while in college called Weather Eye Incorporated. And what we did there was forecasts, and one of our contracts was Channel 9 News. And so my job was to work at Channel 9 in the middle of the night on weekends in the 90s. And back then it was only me and a master control operator in the room in the whole building. So it was very quiet, but I did little weather updates, things like that. Worked for Cavors, who are a private weather company too. If you're a real weather watcher, you might remember Channel 17 radar and weather forecasts. That's one thing we did. For many years, that was a staple for people who really wanted to watch the weather radar and things like that. Then in 1998, started here at the DNR. Lots of media interviews. Still do those today. Lots of talks. Still excited for the next storm. Always interested in phonology. And I was looking at my notes from when I first started here. And one of the first things I did in the office was transcribe lake ice data. So right when I started here, I started looking at lake ice. And I've always been interested in lake ice too. Here's my, as Mark mentioned, my weather log I kept as a kid. This is November 1986. And if you look at it, it must have been cold on November 12th. I wasn't really very old for kind of that squiggly writing, but obviously it was a cold month, and I started noting the ice. This is when the ice covered Lake Wakefield Lake, which is in Maplewood in Ramsey County, and I went skating on the lake in 1986, and you can imagine what would have happened if you start skating on a lake. When you see some kids on a lake, we promptly got in trouble by the neighbors that lived on the lake, who came out to yell at us that we're on the lake, and they were probably right. I don't think I've ever skated on a lake since. So I was very keen on the record, so I was measuring. I don't know how I was doing ice thickness back then. I guess I must have had a way to do it, chipping through the ice or something. So anyway, always interested in lake ice and weather records. So, quick trivia question. Mille Lacs Lake is the second largest natural lake entirely in Minnesota. So we count the Red Lakes as one lake, by the way. And Lake of the Woods is partially in Canada, so that doesn't count. So Mille Lacs is the second largest natural lake. So what is its rank in the whole United States? There's a lot of big lakes for it to compete all over the country. So it actually stacks up pretty good. It's the 21st biggest lake all in the inside the United States. So it's still a big lake. And this plays in to the difficulty of lake ice. How do you do ice out for an enormous lake like Mille Lacs? So Mille Lacs can be very dramatic. Ice out could be dramatic. Anybody lives by a lake, wants to go to a lake. There's nothing more dramatic in the spring from hard water to soft water. I mean, once that ice goes off, you know it's another season. And unfortunately, on places that are big lakes like Mille Lacs, you have a lot of ice, a lot of wind, a lot of fetch. And then I can make the news, and I love this. Good Morning Maryland. I don't know how often Minnesota makes Good Morning Maryland, probably every day, I'm sure. But always dramatic footage. And now with the advent of drones, we're seeing a lot more of these kind of videos come out because it's very easy to fly up and get these pictures. You know, what I always find interesting with these pictures, it's never old homes that are getting destroyed by ice coming off a lake. They always seem to be fairly new. So here's just a quick graph of Mille Lacs ice out. This is ice out for Mille Lacs going back to about 1955 going forward. And what's very interesting about recent years of lake ice is that what we've seen is very high variability. It's either really early, there's at the bottom, March 26, 1912, or very late, um, May 16th, 2013. So there's one quick lesson here is just because you're early lake ice out one year, you have no way to predict what's going to happen the next year. And you can see in recent years, there's lots of variability early and late, early and late. And that kind of fits a lot about of our climate too. We talk about the 50s and the 60s being more of a benign climate period. And that plays in with what we've seen with ice out records too. So lake ice data gathering. People have been interested in lake ice out as part of their phonology observations for many years. If you don't do phonology, I highly recommend it because you don't need any instrument other than your eyes and your ears. All you need to do is go outside. And my favorite phonology for spring, hands down, is red-winged blackbirds coming back. There is, you know when they're back. It's so obvious when they come back. If you note that, that's just a one little simple phonology thing. Fits in with spring. And then lake ice. So wall calendars, been a favorite for lake ice out. And this is one for Lake Cabacona in Hubbard County. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit here. So March 30 is a very early date for Lake Cabacona. And the record earliest is March 24th, 2012. Now, the person that did these records, he grew up on Lake Cabacona, and he started doing these records when he was 15 years old. Let's see, in 1904, and he kept doing it till 1967 when he passed away. So when people start doing phonology for lakes, sometimes it's a lifetime appointment. They just love their lake, whatever lake that is, and they're always watching it. So what we do here in the office, take these those calendars. This is what happened. I put it on a paper like this, put it in spreadsheet or a comma separated file of some kind, ingest it into now a Postgres database, and there we go, ice data. So do you really want to know how people do lake ice out? Here's your chance to leave this talk right now if you really don't want to know how this is done. If you really want to know, stay tuned and we'll find out. Thankfully, over the years, our ice out determination has improved. Unfortunately, back in the old days, things can change over time. This is Lake Minnetonka. This is out of the Freshwater Foundation. Did a lot of research. Dick Gray was a founder of the data for the Freshwater Foundation and part of Lake Minnetonka. And at one time, they were using cars when they'd fall through the ice. So it'd be called Dunk the Clunk, and people would have a contest on how long it would take for a car to fall through the ice. So that would be the ice out. So we've been working very hard to weed out those kind of records. They're hard to find because some of this is pretty old, and in some lakes there was cheating by putting salt around the tires of the car so that it would melt faster. So, and also not only that, of course, all the environmental problems with having a car go through the ice and the fluids like that. So these kind of things died away by the 1960s. A lot of them were gone even before that. So everything since the 1960s, no more cars going through the ice. At least not that I know of. So one thing we have in our office is I collect all the, I got a good file on technique. Technique is important. So whenever we do a lake ice out, I strive to have the same person give me the ice out every year because it's their definition on what makes a lake free of ice. And every lake is different. Some people, every last crystal has to be gone from the lake. Sometimes it has to be when you can get to point A to point B, like Mille Lacs. It's if you can get to Isle to Garrison without hitting any ice. That's their definition. And also, the Mille Lacs Lake Messenger newspaper still has contests up there. So if there's a newspaper involved with the lake, like the Ely Timber Jay for Lake Vermilion, there's a newspaper out of Walker for Leech Lake. Trying to think of some other ones. Fountain Lake, Albert Lee area. So anything like that, I let the newspapers determine it. And usually if that's the case, they have a pretty good definition of it. Here's Osakis, one of my favorite lake ice out records we have because it's the longest, most consistent lake we have back to 1867, believe it or not, is how far back Lake Osakis goes. And their interpretation is that when they could no longer see any ice in the lake. So Osakis is a big lake, but not so big where you can't see most of the ways around it. Kind of like Lake Bemidji, another one, a big lake, but not so big like Mille Lacs, where it's very difficult to see if there's something still in the middle. Another one here is Rainy Lake. This is determined when a boat could travel from the Shasha Resort to the Kettle Falls Hotel. So very, very specific. And then you're wondering, well, how far could that possibly be? Let's put it this way. I wouldn't do it with a 5-horse motor. It is a long way from the Shasha Resort to the Kettle Falls Hotel. I have no idea if this is what they really do in the spring up there. Someday I'll find out. Do they really take a boat? And maybe they do. Sometimes I wonder, how long could they do this? But maybe it's a challenge to make that journey. So lake ice data gathering over the years. The annual lake ice page on the website is the second most popular item in the spring. Lake Finder on the DNR site is #1 for us. Now this is a sample of what we used to do for lake ice out. Going backwards in time, this is in the early 2000s. We had kind of the benchmark lakes that we had many years of data for. And we'd have just this list of lakes on our website, and then we'd just update it when the ice would go out. And have a little historical averages and extremes too. So not a lot of lakes. Now we have many more lakes thanks to the MPCA. Shannon Martin helps us out, and also with the DNR2 sand defect over there at Riverbend sends us data as well. And I got to give big shout out to Jim Gilbert. If you don't know who Jim Gilbert is, he's a phonologist, naturalist. Writes a column on Nature's Notes in the Star Tribune. Used to be on WCCO, and he's been doing this lake ice out business for 50 years, and he calls all kinds of people all day long. And you think I have a lot of papers in my office. I don't even want to know how many papers he has in his office of all the lake ice data he has. And I talk to him all the time in the spring. Any minute now, my phone's going to ring, and it'll be Jim telling me the first ice is out in Martin County. Usually Martin County is early, maybe a few rivers, Cannon River or something like that too. So they're usually the first ones that go out. In case you're wondering, it takes about a month for the ice to go out, for the first one to go out and the last one to go out. No matter what time of year it starts, it takes about a month to go across the whole state, kind of the progress of spring. So nowadays, people can get the data a lot easier. We have a great web application here. The balloons are colored for how late the ice is going out. and people can click on their balloon and they can, see what the ice is going out, what the date was for this year or the year before, and then you can go back in the past. So we have all the data available to people, whoever would like to take a look at it. So what about the trends here? See what trends, there's been a lot of work done on this in recent years. Since we're the keepers of the data here, we're very happy to offer it to anybody who wants to look at trends. And not every lake's the same. It's better to look at trends of lakes with a lot of numbers of lakes because of some issues that could be with data gathering, something with were you looking at the bay of a lake or the whole lake? So the more lakes you look at, the better your data set is. So this is just one. This is Lake Osakis, the longest lake ice out record we have in Minnesota, 1867 to 2021. And I pointed out, just like Mille Lacs, we have these really highly variable years recently. 2012 was not the earliest on record. So if we have any lakes in the state with the record from 1878, those still stand as the earliest lake ice outs we have in Minnesota. And this is also true for any lakes with data in Wisconsin around the Madison area. There's Lake Mendota and Monona. They have ice out records back to the 1870s as well. And that's been called the year without a winter. So it's one of those really standout winters, 1878. But you can see that in recent years that we've had a lot of early and a lot of late. But overall, the trend is getting for less duration of ice. So looking at the past 50 years, which is a good benchmark because beginning about 50 years ago, we've really fine-tuned our data analysis. I think we're getting a lot better at data collection. And frankly, we have a lot more lakes to go from. So the PCA DNR teamed up to help out with this lake ice season web product here and some kind of news information that was passed out. We had a great meeting at Medicine Lake with the media to talk about this, and just some tidbits here. Lake Bemidji, Beltrami County, we've lost about 18.9 days in the past 50 years. Lake Waconia, another great lake. This is Jim Gilbert's lake, and he's been the sole person past 50 years looking at this data. About 2 weeks there, or 14 days there. Lake Itasca, another great lake, 14 days. Even in the south, it's about the same. So all throughout the state, any lakes with data that's about 50 years or so that we can rely on show about the same kind of pattern. And if you gather them all, put them on a chart, it looks something like this. Over time, less ice cover in, and this is for lakes with like ice in and ice out. Ice in is a lot more trickier to put a handle on than ice out. Ice out is very dramatic. Ice in, you could freeze a lake and then it thaws and then freezes again. So you have to be very careful with the records and try to count the number of days when it's finally frozen over to when it thaws. So thankfully, if you have enough lakes, you can put them all together with a graph like this, and you really get a better feeling on what the duration is. And you can see that it varies quite a bit too. So some years, like this year, we're having a pretty good hard water season. We'll have a fairly long lake ice duration. We've had some good ice this year. December kind of started a little shaky, but January, February have been pretty good. So one of my favorite topics, and the most difficult one of them all, is the biggest lake, Lake Superior ice. This is Lake Superior on the North Shore, May 14th, 2014. If you miss winter and you really just want some more winter in the middle of May, drive up to the North Shore and you will find winter. And you might even see some ice. And so I've been trying to collect records on Lake Superior ice over the years. Up in the Duluth, I think it's University of Duluth, has a special archive section, and they have the Duluth Weather Bureau logbooks. And in these logbooks, they have ice coverage notations back to the 19th century. The biggest problem with Lake Superior, of course, is they're limited to visual inspection and reports. A lot of it is people, shipping and people just visually looking out over the lake. Sometimes you get reports from around the lake. But what we can find is, and which makes sense with these winters too, is that they talk about substantial ice. You know, one of my main sources is the Duluth Weather Bureau, where these books are from, and they talk about ice as far as the eye can see kind of comments. And there's substantial ice in all these years, you know, many more than that. But it would be really great to find out, you know, what could have been the coverage in those years. And maybe we'll never know. There's some tantalizing products I hear about, some stories. There's one about people that went from the Keweenaw Peninsula to Isle Royale one year in the 19th century. And then some people believe the story, they don't believe the story. But that would give you a good feeling for there's a lot of ice in the lake if you could travel from the Keweenaw Peninsula in Michigan to Isle Royale. You know, those are the things we can still work on and gather. And then, of course, the modern era, once satellites came into play, you know, early 1970s, our job got a little bit easier with the bigger lakes. I use satellite in the spring for the big lakes too, like Mille Lacs, the Red Lakes, Lake of the Woods. And the problem with satellites is that it can tell you the ice is on, but it can't tell you if it's out. And the reason why is because obviously if the lake is white with snow, the ice is on. But once it turns dark, it sometimes is hard to tell, is that ice really gone or is just the ice that dark? So it's very tricky to tell sometimes. But luckily there's other people looking at Lake Superior ice. This is the Great Lakes Environmental Research Laboratory, and this is their chart going backwards in time. And if you look at this chart, you can almost see there's two phases here. We have basically the 70s to the 90s, where you have a lot of years of high ice cover on Superior. Look at those dots up, higher than 80% ice cover, many years. And then once about 2000 or even a few years before, you don't see as many 80% ice cover years. The most I could find in the satellite era is 1996, where it was nearly 100% covered. And even that, it was only nearly 100% covered. There was still, I think, along the North Shore, a little bit of an open lead of water. So what about this year? What's going on in 2022? So you could follow this along. I got a link down below there. And you could follow along Lake Superior ice cover, and that kind of the line looks like a little mountain. That's the median date from 1973 through 2021. So basically the satellite era. And this year, you know, we were starting out a little below the median, then we popped up above the median. Then right now, yesterday, we're right at the median. So kind of an average lake ice cover year for Superior. And of course, the winter's not quite over yet. I noticed some of those, if you look to the right in May, sometimes in May, you could be 60% ice covered in Superior. I guess we'll have to see what happens this year. So lake ice forecast. Believe it or not, our office used to do lake ice out forecasts. And it began in the mid 70s and it continued right up to 1999. Thankfully, it ended right when I started working. Based on a study by Earl Keenis to try to approximate ice out with frost depth and disappearance of snow cover. He tried to say when the frost goes out, the ice will go out. And then also when the snow cover disappears, you know, it's a good chance you're warming up the ground around the lake. And the first thing that happens in ice out is you start to thaw out that shoreline around the lake. You know, water will start heating up on the shore. The sun is very strong in April. Will heat up the water, heat up the underneath the water, and you begin to get the candles in the ice too. And eventually it rots the ice and goes away. So Earl tried to figure this out, and I kind of followed along since then. He's pretty close. You know, once the frost goes out, that's a good sign that the ice is going to go out soon too. And of course, you can imagine people loved this product. Who wouldn't? If somebody's going to try to predict the ice out here, here's the image. There's from he was prepared it March 31st, okay, 1986, and he was saying the ice was going to go out let's say Mille Lacs area, April 14th to 21st. So what Earl was doing here is he was predicting the weather for the next 3 or 4 weeks. And you can imagine what could have happened if your forecast 3-4 weeks from now wasn't very good. So if you're all ready to open up the cabin, get that dock out, and let's say the forecast didn't pan out, people were not happy. So what we found out is it's very hard to predict the future. And just to show how popular of an item this was, this would be put in the newspapers right away. And and it's a great effort. And sometimes they did pretty good. If the forecast was good, if the weather was fairly predictable, you could guess pretty good what the ice out would be. But unfortunately, there was a few years in the 90s where it turned late, cold late in the season. I want to say, some, in the mid 1990s, and the forecasts weren't that great. So what I can safely tell you today is as of March 10th, right now, all the lakes in the state are ice covered. So if you go to our 2022 lake ice out dates, it's a blank slate right now. So I'm hoping by the end of this month, I'll be able to put one balloon on this map. It'll probably be a lake. Usually Iowa Lake in Minnesota is one of the first to go out. It's way down there in Martin County near the Iowa border, or maybe Cannon Lake, which is more like a river, south of the Twin Cities. A few of those might go out, and Lake Pepin's another one we always look at too, complicated lake. So we're ready for this season, and all we have to do is have the weather cooperate. So thank you, everybody. And, if anybody's got any questions on Lake Ice Out, I'd be happy to try to answer them. And I guess you can put in your own guesses when you think the ice will go out.
So, Pete, there are no predictions on your end on when the ice is going to go out statewide. Come on, you can do it.
I just know that in the south part, it won't be early at this point. I try in my head. I do think, sometimes, okay, will we be the median or not? And what can really happen is we could have a 2-week spell of way above normal temperatures first week of April, and that completely changes everything. And that we've seen in the past where we have a sluggish start, a big warm spell, and then the ice out line races north. So I would, obviously we're now looking at early Marches below normal so far. So as long as we stay below normal and we keep getting more snow events, that kind of keeps pushing off lake ice out. Yesterday I drove from here to western Minnesota, and I was surprised to see how bare the landscape was of snow. That's a good sign that we could have spring quick if we get the warm air back. If we don't have a snow cover, all that solar radiation is going to heat the ground, so we could bounce back very quickly and have a warm spring. So anything's possible. Do you like how I didn't answer that question?
Very, very, very practiced. Yeah, that's good. So if anyone has any questions for Pete, either type them into the chat. We can answer them. Or Pete can answer them,
Yeah,
or unmute and just go ahead and ask a question.
Hi, this is Scott. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
So I've been looking into drought history, and one of the things that I find really interesting is when you look at the paleoclimate research, these researchers are able to go back 1,000, 2,000 years and look at what droughts were like in Minnesota, back then. And there were some really severe droughts, and if you go back 500, 1,000 years in Minnesota's history. And I'm wondering, can you use any of that paleoclimate research, tree rings, sediment cores, to estimate what ice out was like 500 years ago? Because right now you have a 100-year data set basically, and it's pretty noisy. So when you talk about average, well, average has a pretty high range to it, So when you're saying deviating from average, what does that really mean?
Yeah. Okay. Great. That's a great idea with that. Trying to find other proxy data for ice out. I've had some success with fur trader records. It's interesting. We always think, well, us Americans, we're here forever in Minnesota, right? Well, not necessarily so. The French were here before us. Well, the British, then the French were here before us, and their records are elsewhere, not necessarily here. And one of my quests was to find a June lake ice out in Minnesota because I knew it was possible. And actually, I found one up in the far northeast in the 1930s. But also, since the fur traders were relying on open water to move canoes in the season, I've had some luck finding records there. The difficulty is they're so transient, they're only there a brief moment and they're gone. But there is some sign in the 1700s, 1800s of some pretty late ice outs. Of course, the ones that stand out to people are what's dramatic, and that would be it. And Scott, if I could find a way, I don't know, I could ask the limnology folks about, is there anything about ice and, um, you know, any other proxies like tree rings or something like that? I don't know. I mean, maybe it kind of give you the temperature idea, but I don't know about ice. But, you know, there is definitely more records that could be looked at, you know, for getting more data. One thing, another I would like to explore more is Lake Pepin. You couldn't get it. Lake Pepin was so important to get across the river. If anybody's a Laura Ingalls fan, you know, there's a story in there where they're in Lake Pepin to cross, or yeah, Pepin, Wisconsin, to get across, and they had to get across for the ice broke up, because then you weren't getting across the Mississippi River, and they got across, and then it broke up. So that's why we have pretty good records of Lake Pepin, but they're not complete. We're missing about 40, 50 years, and not in the 19th century either. So there's plenty of more data we could find for sure. And then people probably have it somewhere. Okay, I see some chat questions here. Okay, let's see here. Oh, curious way of measuring ice that I've come across. I always find, okay, the most curious one is got to be Lake Minnetonka, because they give their ice out down to the minute. And it's and right now we rely on the Hennepin Water Patrol to determine ice out. They want to be the ones to declare it. They do work with the Freshwater Foundation and other folks, but they need to get the buoy markers out for the channels in Minnetonka. So they need to know exactly when it's out. And so out of all the people that have done it, that's one of the more unique ways, is nobody else does it down to the minute. Another chat question. Ice out oscillating early and late for most years. Is that a pattern that is widespread? Yes. 2012 was a year in phonology that I couldn't find another proxy, at least for 100 years. The only other close year I could find in 2012 in the spring was 1910. That was another drought year. 2012 was a drought year. Looks like I got a fan behind me. There's Kenny Blumenfeld who helps me with a lot of these things too in the office with lake ice. So yes, this is very tied to spring weather. 2012 was extraordinarily warm, and then had the record early lake ice outs, and we don't have a huge across the country huge records. The only good ones I know of locally is in Wisconsin. I would love Iowa ice out data, Missouri ice out data. If it exists, I'd love to just take a look at it and compare it to ours too. So you know, that would be fun. We were kind of provincial here in Minnesota, unfortunately, you know, with the data. But Google Madison Lake ice out, and you'll see even longer records. They have like 3 Osakis lakes right there. So they got some great products there. Data on ice thickness. That's a good question. We've tried over years to try to match. The thicker the ice, is it harder to go out? And in the end, it doesn't seem to matter. It's all about the spring. We've had, you know, kind of winters that don't stand out at all, but then all of a sudden they get really cold in the spring, and you know, the winter just continues on and on and on. So it doesn't always matter. Now, what it could matter is more of what happens when the ice gets pushed up on shore. That could make a big difference. And that's a great question. I don't have a lot of data on thickness of ice and what happens to it. But that's a good question.
Kind of as a follow-on to that, Pete, one of the things I've always wondered about forever, and now you're going to answer it for me,
Uh-oh.
is what is more important? Is it the angle of the sun in the spring, or is it the air temp that is more important in melting the ice? I've always thought it's probably more the angle of the sun.
That's part of it. The intensity of the radiation definitely is a factor. What's probably bigger is the albedo of the lake. So, if sun or snow on a lake is 80 or 90% reflected back into space, if you get rid of that snow, notice how the lake changes color. The darker the lake, the quicker it'll melt. And any particle on a lake, you've seen a lake, it's not really, you wouldn't pick up lake ice and, drink it, right? There's all kinds of little particles in there. All those little dark particles absorb solar radiation and they'll melt the lake, melt the lake ice too, kind of, and that helps to rot it. And if it's warm on the shore, warm water will get in there, warm it up, melt it below too. So yeah, it's the solar angle definitely helps because the higher the sun gets, the more intense the radiation can be. So that's why we know eventually it'll melt. And also, one more thing to add, overnight temperature staying above freezing is huge. If you want to melt lake ice, be sure your overnight temperature is above freezing. If it stays below freezing, then you're making ice. So if you stay above freezing, and also another good ice eater is rain. Rain is definitely above 32 degrees. If that's falling on a lake, you're melting the ice that way too. Lots of ways you can get rid of ice.
Well, do we have any more questions out there for Pete?
Yeah, I guess I had a follow-up to my question, Pete.
Okay.
So you mentioned that it seemed like it was hard to predict based on any given year what the next year was going to be. So my question was, it did look like there was like a 1 year cycle where a high year was followed by a low year, or an early year was followed by a late year, or vice versa. In most years, not every year, certainly. So I was just wondering if that pattern, we see that a lot across all the lakes, and if so, is that some predictive ability to say that if you have a early ice out year, that next year is going to be late?
Let's see. I could take a look at my graph here and take a look about that. A good question. One thing that we've seen, this might be somewhat related, is that notice that the early ice outs are related to droughts. And how do you bust a drought? A huge wet year. And what we've seen is after an intense drought, you can have a really wet year. We've had quite a few times this has happened. 1910, dry year. 1911, really wet. 76, dry. 77, wet. So there might be something to that. That's something to look into. We'll see if it happens this year. And then we will try new predictions, see if we can hold true. Ooh, ice or a wind. That's a great tip from Justin. Yes, wind is huge, especially if you have the right kind of wind and if the fetch is just right, you can start moving that ice. Once wind gets a foothold on the ice, it'll clear out a lake quick. That's a great tip. Thanks, Justin.
Yeah, it just seems like there's so much variability and the factors that cause ice out that you really have to have a lot of data out there to be able to make some conclusions about changes in ice out, statewide, right? I mean, we're talking about a lot of data that's needed to feed into that kind of uh, conclusion that you're seeing 14 less days of ice on the lake statewide, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like in any given year, what can happen is ice could be early, and then it just stops with the weather change. Halfway through the season, and then it could pick up again too. So, that's what's nice about having all the different lakes with data is that we're getting a better and better data set as years go on. But we're still relying on all volunteers. Another thanks to all the people that all these people that we're getting ice data from are just people looking at the lake and reporting to it. A lot of lake associations out there help us out. It gets kind of an interesting thing in the spring. Corps of Engineers, all kinds of people, and some of the lakes are hardest to get are some of those big lakes. There isn't a lot of people we hear from, and if people pass away, who takes on the the challenge to be that person? And sometimes it's hard. People move around more than they used to. So it's getting to be harder to find people that are kind of homebodies and they just live on the lake all the time. Question from Lindsay. How do you find volunteers? How do they find you? Both. Yes, they usually if somebody is elderly and they have their nephew take over, they sometimes introduce me to, this is who's going to be doing it from now on. In modern era, Facebook has been big. People can post their ice out on Facebook, and I have to be a little careful on that sometimes because sometimes people can be, I don't know, excited for the ice to be out quicker than it could be. Maybe there are definitely people who love to fish and they can't wait to get out. So they sometimes they find me that way too. And all year long I get emails from people that I have this list of ice out dates, and thankfully I have a volunteer named Jeff Peters that comes in once a week and he helps me out with the data so I can put it on that site too. So yeah, Lindsay, but anybody can be a volunteer. There's plenty of lakes out there that we struggle to get ice data from. So yeah, there's a few that we have really good records, and the few I'd love to. The hardest ones, of course, you can imagine the boundary waters, because there's nobody living at the boundary waters. So I rely on the pilots that are flying up there for fire issues. So I call their office, and hopefully they can get it. No lake is too small to collect data from. The key is if it's in our DNR database, if it has a DNR number, that's the key. If it has a number, we can do it. Yep, everybody can. And small lakes are kind of neat because it gives you a warning that the other ones will go out. So usually the first lakes will go out, the little ones, and then you got the medium-sized ones, and and then the big lakes. So kind of like in my neighborhood, Wakefield will go out, Spoon will go out, and then Jarvis will go out, and then it's White Bear Lake and Phelan too. Phelan to be a little earlier. So you can kind of, in a weird way, predict a little bit, a couple days, because you see the trend.
So Pete, how many lakes statewide do you have people reporting ice out data on, or maybe what percentage of lakes,
We have 11,842, and I get about 500. My goal every year is to get 1,000. So I'd love to get 10% of the lakes. But when you think about it, we get people asking, how come you don't have ice out for my lake? And I'm like, well, there are 11,000 lakes and, we only have so much. So, and I always give them the challenge. I go, well, if you have an ice out, I'll gladly add it to it. And sometimes they do.
We have any more questions for Pete out there? This is fascinating, Pete. Thanks for coming and talking to us today about this.
Sure. I'm ready for spring now, Mark. I don't know about everybody else here, but
yeah,
now I'm excited.
Your first picture of your first slide there of Lake Itasca, I think it was, right? It got me in the mood to get my canoe out.
Oh, that would be nice. Might have to wait a few days.
Yeah. Well, I can get it out.
Be a little slow.
Set it on the ice,
And to wait.
Well, if there are no more questions for Pete, last call. Pete, thanks again, for the talk. Definitely fascinating stuff. I think you saw by your attendance today, a lot of interest in it.
Well, thanks for having me, Mark. And I'll have to come back again in a year or two and see how we did with the this year. Can't wait to find out.
Yeah. Thanks again.